Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest Retail Think Tank Ideation Session. I'm Alicia Esposito, VP of Content for Retail Touchpoints, and I am so excited to have on the show with me today Rebekah Kondrat, founder and managing partner of Rekon Retail. Rebekah, thanks so much for taking the time out. So great to have you.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
And the big reason why I was especially excited to have you on is because we cover so much about the in store experience, even store design, like the creative aspects, but of course, operations, all of the tactical behind the scenes stuff. That's really what makes these great stores come to life. And you have an incredible career in stores, working for brands like Apple, Starbucks, Warby Parker, all brands that I personally love. But I guess my question for you is, what do you love most about just being in this industry, being in retail, and of course, in the store space specifically?
Yeah. So, something that we say is retail is magic. And you'll kind of see that throughout, some of our copy on our website, et cetera. And that's really kind of springs from the belief that it can change someone's day, like a physical retail environment, a great experience can change someone's day. It could, spark a new idea. And of course, I mean, commerce is so important to the world, and it is a very substantial part of what makes us all tick. We all need to go into stores and buy things, and sometimes it's utility and sometimes it's entertainment. You got to get lotion, but you also want to get that fancy dress. So I think there's just something about the human to human interaction that happens in stores that's kind of that like magical moment where a customer, starts to either think about themselves differently, or even just something as simple as like, I got something I needed today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think the brands I mentioned before, they are especially known for how they think about the in-store experience in both of those aspects, right? Like Starbucks has been able to really master that mobile driven experience, right? To make it very fast and easy. Whereas Warby Parker and Apple, it's very, in many aspects, very high touch and all about being immersed into the brand and into the products. But regardless, they're all really known for knowing their audience and kind of mastering that experience. And I guess my question there is, what about your experience working for these brands ultimately inspired you or motivated you even to start Rekon? Were there any through lines or areas that you were like, oh, I really think there's an opportunity here that is possibly overlooked or under tapped right now?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to have some pretty amazing experience at Apple and Starbucks. I mean, these brands are, I guess, what you would consider to be legacy brands, right? They're not startups by any stretch of the imagination. They had systems and processes in place for operations, which is something that we at Rekon are very passionate about. And I'm excited to talk a little bit more about. But, they also had that aspect of like, customer experience, and how do we train a large team to give a consistent customer experience every single time. How do we think through how the inventory is received so that then we can get it out to the customer faster, like all of those like nuts and bolts, infrastructure and like scalability, all of that was learned there. And then when I went over to Warby Parker, which at the time was kind of one of the first D2C brands,
Yeah.
like, oh, we sold online and now we're building stores and now we're expanding stores. And at the time when I joined, they only had 3 stores open, right? So it was very early on. There was this kind of, now I get to see what it's like to build something from the beginning, right? Like the company, of course, existed and the product was already great, but they had never done retail before. And so to enter into that environment and see, oh, you don't have any of these standards and processes like Apple had, like Starbucks had, right? And so now we get to build this, but we're not just going to take like a carbon copy of Apple's policies and plop it into Warby Parker. That doesn't work. It's a totally different business. And so really having to think critically about, what's best for this specific brand in its current place, in its journey to kind of becoming that like lifestyle brand, right? That $100 million brand is kind of seems to be the benchmark of achievement these days, right? So once I did that for Warby, I then went on to Outdoor Voices, again, very
Yeah.
early on, and found that they were tackling the same problems, even though it was a totally different industry, right? Eyewear, apparel, like, not quite the same. One was quite technical and one was more like fun, recreational, but the problems were the same. They still had to build
Yeah.
the infrastructure. They still had to make standard operating procedures. And so after doing that a couple of times, and then after Outdoor Voices, I went to Joybird Furniture, which was also, again,
Yeah.
another
Very
D2C
different.
furniture brand, now acquired by Lazy Boy. Same problems. And I was like, hold on. I see a through line here. These
Yeah.
brands need help, and they need help really at these kind of early stages, either retail entry or retail expansion. And that's kind of where the impetus for Rekon Retail was born. Was there needs to be some entity that comes alongside these brands as a trusted partner, as an embedded resource that can help them kind of grow into the place where they can then hire an in-house team, right? Because that needs to happen eventually. We believe that very strongly, is that if a brand sees retail as a substantial part of its growth trajectory, eventually it needs to fully own the channel. It needs to have a VP of
Mm,
retail, or whatever that looks like for the brand, a district manager, some sort of multi-unit manager needs to have those functions in-house. But until they have that, until they're able to do that, until they make enough revenue to do that, until they have enough bandwidth to do that, they need a trusted partner. And as far as I could tell, one did not exist. And so
right.
I made
And
it.
now you're here. Yeah.
Here we are.
When in doubt, make it, right?
There you
Um,
go.
so with that, I mean, incredible context. And I think the fact that you have had experience on both sides, so to speak, with a few legacy brands that have the teams, the procedures, the operations, and you were able to, look for the gaps for these smaller brands, especially the ones that are maybe so new. They're like, we don't really know what the future of this store strategy is going to look like, how many stores we're going to have, what that team should look like. It's great that you can kind of help close those gaps. But, you noted the fact that every brand is different, of course. Every category has its nuances, especially when it comes to standing up an in store experience. So, how do you and your partner, Libby Shani, go into each project? Like, are there any standard questions you ask? Is there a framework, so to speak, that kind of guides your approach and how you help the client go through those early stages or phases of the project?
Yeah. So we always start off, and I will say this about Libby, we have very similar backgrounds and a complementary skill set. I mean, she is the operations master, but also comes from great brands like Chanel and Figs and Container Store, and brands known for not only customer experience but also operations. So there's this really nice synergy, and we always approach the first project with a brand with an audit, and that sometimes is quite extensive. Right? We need to look into what systems do you currently have, what is your like personnel structure, because if chances are, if a brand has never had a retail store before, they don't have anyone on staff who has ever really even worked in a retail store. I mean, maybe they worked at McDonald's when they were a teenager, but like has never actually worked in retail. So we kind of do a full audit to see where are you at, what are the resources that we can tap into that you might not know about. What is the tech stack that you're using currently to help us inform like what point of sale system we should use, what traffic counting system we should use, those kinds of things. And then we also seek to understand the pillars of the brand experience, right? Because it's one thing to put branding on your website and you have a color palette and a logo that's recognizable and a font and even like copy that is very specific to the brand, like the ethos of the brand comes out in that way. Now, when you move all of that into the physical, it's great to start there. You need your colors, you need a logo, you need copy, signage, etc. But now it's, what do you want your customer to feel, and how do we help them feel it through the experience that your in-store associates are giving to them, right? And so that's what we always look to understand first is, what is your current infrastructure? Let's check, let's do an audit. And then what is your actual desired customer experience and what is the purpose of your store, right? Is it to, obviously it's to make money. Hopefully we believe in stores that make money. We don't believe in stores as loss leaders. But is it to better understand your customer? Is it to develop new products? Is it to convert a different type of customer, right? Like you have a belief that maybe you're missing this whole customer and you need to actually work to talk to that customer. So that's kind of where we start off. And then we create pretty bespoke offerings for brands based on the findings so that we can then help them get to that point where retail is that substantial part of their growth.
Oh, that's great. And following our discussion so far, digging into the nuances of different brands and how they go about marrying those goals to the final product, so to speak, in this case, the product being the store. I do want to dig into some recent projects that your team has done, which you were so kind to share with me. And what I love about these examples is that they represent different categories, different goals, possibly experiences, but also different stages of growth and where they're at in their brick and mortar journeys. So, the first I want to dig into a little bit further is Olfactory, which is a really fun custom fragrance concept if nobody knows about them. But they also have different products. They have the fragrances, they have candles, a few other things. And what I find so interesting about this in-store concept is, of course, there are a few different senses at play here, right? There are different products, and sometimes the journey can look different. It can be very customization driven, right? Which is one journey, or people can just kind of go in and out and get what they need. So, how did you think through the planning and execution of this concept, and where was the client, in this case, the brand, at? Because I feel like I've seen this brand is growing, they're opening more stores. So how did they think about this project going in, and how did you collaborate with them?
Yeah. So Olfactory is a really fun one, and we are so excited and honored to be working with them. When they came to us, they had two already very successful stores. They
Mm,
had Mott Street and Bleecker Street, both in Manhattan, but both, and that's kind of rare, right? You have two stores in the same geo, and both of them are doing like killing it, right? So they knew they had something. And so they came to us because they wanted to expand, but oftentimes a brand has done everything from the beginning again, right? Like you open your second store, but you kind of don't carry over things from the first store because of lack of infrastructure or whatever it is. And so they came to us because they were like, we need a partner to help us build what we call a kit of parts. And this is one of our specialties at Rekon is we will help brands build kits of parts, and that doesn't just include like your fixture package. I mean, of course it does. That is important. You need a clear fixture package and a vendor and or an ordering sheet, all of this so that you can kind of just rinse and repeat, at least call it 80% of your build out, right? And each store, the thing the Olfactory is so good at is each store has these kind of nuanced differences. For example, the Newberry Street store that we just opened has a speakeasy in the back. Not every
ooh,
store has
fun.
that, right? And so like
Yeah.
each store is unique. It's not like you're making cookie cutter stores that are exactly the same, but there is there's a cost savings, there's a time savings that comes from this kind of kit of parts. And so they had the concept, they had the colors, they had the like fun vibe. Of course, they have a great product, they had all of that already. So for us, it was more about what creative partners do we bring in? What fabricators do we talk to? What, digital experiences do we help them bring in to their stores so that they can replicate the success of Bleecker and Mott, but then they can also kind of take it up a notch, right? They can
Hmm.
level it up and help the customer in a brand new market where they've never opened, like Boston,
Yeah.
really experience their store. So recently we opened Georgetown on M Street and Newbury Street, and there's more that I can't quite disclose yet, but there's more on the way. Don't worry. If you're not in the Northeast, we have non Northeast stores coming. But no, that for us was really about like, okay, your concept is great. We don't need to change anything. How do we
Yeah.
make it repeatable? How do we make it scalable so that you can go and open 5, 10, 20 more stores?
Super exciting. And I'm glad you called out some of those unique experiential elements that aren't in every store, because I know a lot of our readers, a lot of our listeners, they're looking into, how do we add these components into stores? How do we test it? How do we, start small and then figure out how to scale from there? So I think calling out some of those nuances is really important. The next one I want to talk about is M.M.LaFleur. And we have a few stories coming down the pipeline from them, which is very exciting because I have been an early follower of the brand and I've kind of seen its evolution from, very workwear based to more everyday, more casual, more you know, athleisure based, but still high quality and still sophisticated, which seems to be their aesthetic or their vibe that they're going for. But again, another brand that is growing, but possibly in different ways. So, how did you, stay true to the story of the brand? How did you, consider its personality, its positioning, and really turn that into an actionable plan for what the stores could become from, again, largely an operations standpoint.
Yeah. So they are, and I will confess, I was also an early, I've been an MM customer for years, visited their Bryant Park showroom, was very excited when, we were kind of put in touch with them and excited to work with them. But they are actually an example. So while Olfactory has this kind of replicable concept that's pretty fleshed out, and yes, there are like nuanced changes and tweaks that have been made for different markets, et cetera, they pretty much stay the same. What they have
Yeah.
is working. With MM, it really, I think you use the word evolution. It really has been an evolution. So it's gone from, how have we done temporary stores, right? Because
Mm.
like that's oftentimes brands will test with temporary stores, which is great. We're big fans of prototyping. Let's, make sure that something works, right? From testing a fixture type or testing a market or testing a store size, that kind of thing, to now, okay, we've done the temp thing, we've learned a lot. Now, what changes do we need to make? What changes do we need to make to our fixture package? What changes do we need to make to the way we store our inventory? What changes do we need to make to the visual elements of the store in order to kind of continue with that very sophisticated, yet, nuancedly different than when they first launched, when they were very workwear focused, as you said, and that obviously is still a core of the brand.
Yep.
So one thing that's been really fun with them is they have these, I don't know what to call it. They have like a visual element that's like a pop of color in all of their stores. You'll
Mhm.
see it in every single store. It's kind of this yellow amorphous mural, but helping that go from what kind of was like a yellow blob into, okay, what do you want this to be? And, how does this kind of play into that sophistication, right? Art, culture, like all of those things. Like how does that play in to the sophistication? And what is really Sarah LaFleur, like working very closely with her to understand what is your vision for this mural? And, can we bring in local artists to help you realize this vision? And so in Georgetown, we were
Mm.
able to do that. In Philadelphia, which opens very, very soon, stay tuned, in Philadelphia, that mural has kind of evolved. It's still there. It's still the pop of color. It's still in their Pantone, but it's evolved into something that's a bit more of really a work of art, which has been very exciting to see. Not only that, but we've of course helped them update their fixture package, make sure that that customer journey throughout the store makes sense and is in line with what they're desiring, from a physical standpoint. Um, Streamlined operations, back of house, all of those things that the customer doesn't think about unless they're not working properly,
Yep.
and it takes 5 minutes for them to bring you your pair of pants that you just asked for a different size of, and suddenly you're like, what's happening here? So all of those invisible things that really do make the store run and make the customer experience magical,
Yeah.
um, are the things that we have worked with them on as well.
I love that artist element. I think it's such a unique and personal way to connect with local communities and also still have it be a brand friendly element. And, we talked about what makes each client and, the projects very distinct and different. I'm curious, between these particular projects or even others, are there any correlations or trends that you're seeing, like in terms of goals or even challenges, right? Because, our goal is to kind of ladder up, these use cases, these examples to broader trends and, broader industry perspective. So have there been any notable takeaways in, the project phases and process that you think kind of aligns with what's happening in the industry at large?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things happening that we're seeing pretty consistently. I think the first is it's very hard to find an affordable space right now. I'm talking about real estate
Mm,
in a
yeah.
desired area, right? A well-foot traffic, whether it's mall or street front, it is challenging. I mean, we had a time, I remember, like right as we were kind of coming out of COVID, and it was like late 21, early 22, where you could get these amazing deals and
Yeah.
landlords were willing to take a chance on a new brand, and give some more favorable shorter term deals so that they could kind of see if it worked or not, whatever. Um, that unfortunately has kind of largely flipped, and
Yeah.
now we're seeing it's very difficult to get a short-term deal period, but it's also difficult to get one that's not astronomically expensive. So that is a real challenge. I am a very big believer that it's all cyclical. It'll come back
Mm,
around,
yeah.
eventually. But in the moment that we're in right now, that's tough. And so I think when a brand finds a good deal, it needs to act quickly because we've seen them snatched up before,
Wow.
a decision has been made. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is just there is something that's very exciting for me on like the positive side is there is more of a focus on customer experience, personalization, right? I think brands in who are opening new stores in retail, the ones that we are talking to, even ones that we're not engaged with yet, but they're just kind of exploring it, are very adamant that they want their customer experience to be top notch. They want their store environment to be unique.
Hmm.
And I think there's, kind of dovetailing into that, there's this interest in um, additive, what I would call additive technology, not like holograms that you're like, what is
Right.
that even? What am I supposed to do with this? Like there are certainly applications for things like that, but largely it's a press play. Really, it's not
Yeah.
adding anything to the
Agree.
customer experience, but like actual technology that helps the customer make a decision about their purchase, or that makes a decision about the brand and am I even aligned with this brand? That kind of storytelling aspect, the education aspect. We're working with a client right now that nothing is final and announced, but they have some really interesting technology that's coming out that like allows the customer to sample things, both assisted and
Ooh.
unassisted. And so it's things
Okay.
like that that we're like, oh, this is actually helpful to the customer experience and not just some like gadget that's in the corner of your store that you
Hmm.
open, maybe the press covers it and then it collects dust for 10 years, right? Like why buy a $10,000 paperweight?
Yeah.
So that has been very exciting to see.
Yeah. And is there anything else that you've seen, not just in, your client stores, but even just out and about? Because I'm sure like me, like being in the industry, when you go to other people's stores, new brand locations, like you're probably, I don't want to say nitpicking, but analyzing things, looking more closely at elements than, an everyday consumer may. So is there anything else that you're seeing in the market right now that is really exciting you or even sparking your personal creativity as someone who is helping other brands?
Yeah, what do you mean? You don't, not everyone goes into stores and starts like
Not
snapping
everyone looks at the
pictures?
POS.
Yeah, like I'm like, ooh, this is a really clean cable run. Let me just take a picture. Like what? They're like, what are you doing? No, yes, actually, I recently went into, and we're friendly with them and helped them open their first Salt Lake City store. So full disclosure, but I recently went into the Kizik Motion is Magic
I
pop
love
up
the
that was
Kizik
in
pop-up. Yes.
Soho. I mean, I'm already a customer. My whole
Me
family
too.
is to this, but
We seem to
um,
have very similar taste in brands, I've noticed.
yeah, like hello. We should do a shopping trip together.
We should.
So Kizik, they have been, talk about evolution. They have been kind of on this brand journey evolution that Monty, the CEO, has been like very public about talking about, and they have their new kind of motion is magic branding. And I thought it was so smart the way that, you walked in and the product was the hero, right? Like
Yeah.
immediately on the wall, there were these shoes kind of walking up the wall. And then obviously it had all of the shoes displayed and even some new styles that I hadn't even seen yet, which was very exciting to me. But then kind of in the back, there was this really interesting installation with a projector that moved and there was nothing about shoes back there really. I mean, it was really
Mm.
more of like a here's who we are as a brand. And, I think for a pop up, like that kind of experience really works. Would you want to dedicate that much square footage in a store to something that really didn't help you sell shoes that much? I'm not sure. But like for a pop up, I think, and what, it was kind of their launch event of their new Motion is Magic campaign, I thought it really worked. I think a lot of their branding is very smart. So I think like in some of these short term retail experiences, like I didn't make it there, but I looked at a lot of pictures and posts about the Sol de Janeiro pop up, like kind of
Mm.
similar thing, right? It was like, let's experience this. It wasn't like product packed on shelves and, like stack it high, watch them fly, kind of, as the old adage is,
Yeah.
but it was really more about here's who we are as a brand. And here, customer, is what we want you to know about us so that then you can come back. And I have no idea if they plan to build real, like, permanent stores long term, but if and when they do, there's now that kind of brand affinity out there in the ethos that, like, okay, we've introduced ourselves to this customer and they know who we are and what we're about. So I think that those kind of more short term activations have been really exciting because it's not just let's put up some IKEA fixtures and put out our product, but it
Yeah.
really has been they've been thoughtfully crafted around the brand story.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's what makes pop-ups so fun. It kind of creates that opportunity for brands to stretch the creative boundaries a little bit, even if it's, through the lens of, activations. Sometimes they bring in partners for these pop-ups, and that kind of allows them to not just build some of that buzz and credibility in some cases, but also test, what could this, does this have legs basically to scale and possibly turn into something, across several stores or even the whole fleet. And that's one thing that we saw in our store design and experience survey this year, that more brands and retailers are thinking about, how do we use these components, these activations, these partnerships to make us feel closer to the community, right? And I think that's why, brands like Camp are so effective. Like they have the core retail down and like their merchandising strategy is great, et cetera. But it's those experiential components that make them feel like they can get closer to the customer in a different way than simply having the right product at the right price. So I'm curious, have you seen any brands kind of embrace this convergence, so to speak, of community and commerce, even culture, right? To really create those more immersive spaces. I know we're kind of getting into like store design territory, but I'm curious like what you're seeing. And I mean, even if there's anything you could share from an operations standpoint that, folks watching this may need to think about if they want to do something like this.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up operations because for
Gets a little tricky, I'm
every,
sure.
well, seriously, for every like seamless community or store experience, there's a lot of planning. There's probably a run of show document. There's probably, there's all of these
Yeah.
logistics that go into that the customer really, if it's executed correctly, should not ever see or feel or think about. But they are very important to, making those things successful. And so I think there are actually two brands that do this really well. I think Rhone, the
Mm.
what actually used to be exclusively men's apparel and have just recently released a women's line that I'm very excited about, does this quite well with, in their stores when they think about putting together a space, and I know the brand quite well. They think about the modularity of it, and can
Mm.
we have talks in the store, like mental health awareness talks, and can we have, you know, authorities from the fitness industry or from the health and wellness industry come in and speak to our customers? Can we host pop-ups that or pop-ins rather, like shop-in shops that are with
Yeah.
adjacent brands that are have the same mission that we have? I know they do running clubs in different areas, that kind of thing. And so I think that the thing to think through with that is that's great at a broad macro scale to do that and have that be a part of your brand. But what it actually comes down to is each individual store, each store manager, each assistant store manager, each store team member also needs to be bought in and a part of those activations
Mm.
and, supported in it. And so I think what the moral of the story for, kind of the larger brand as a whole is yes, this event is happening in the store, but it requires support from what we would call like the HQ team,
Yeah.
right? And that may or may not be in the same city as the store, may or may not be in the same state as the store, right? So now you have to think through, okay, I have a running club happening across the country, but how can I support, as a marketing team member, how do I support that running club? Or as an operations and
Mm.
logistics team member, how do I support them? Can we get them extra product because they're going to have extra traffic and hopefully, fingers crossed, make extra sales because of this visibility, right? So I think that's the first. And the second is Little Words Project, which, I mean, Taylor
Yeah.
Swift, bracelets, like that whole thing. They have uh, this kind of want to embed themselves with every community that they're a part of. And obviously, the message of positive, affirming words is just so powerful. But they go out of their way to figure out, when we open a new store in a specific area, what are kind of the words, if you will,
Yeah.
of that area? And how do we make the community feel really special by presenting back their words to them in like in their jewelry, right? And so
Mm.
yes, they have the beading bar and you can make personalized jewelry and all of that, but that's something that has to be researched, and they have to talk to members of the community to figure out what those things are. And I think going that extra mile really helps the store to be successful once it does open in that area.
Mm. Yeah, I think Kendra Scott takes a very similar
They
approach.
do.
Like they think through the pop-ins, the partnerships, and they use their associates, I think, as a very big vehicle for getting that insight, which I think is incredibly smart and largely overlooked for a lot of retailers, in my opinion. But I know Recon is all about bringing magic to physical retail. You mentioned it earlier in your conversation, but it's pretty clear from our conversation today that sure, it's all about creating these interactive, discovery friendly, and in some cases social experiences, but it needs to be strong operationally in order for it to execute well and really stand out to the customer. Like you mentioned, it's the stuff that goes wrong that people always remember and note. Even though operations, it tends to be relatively invisible to the customer's eye. So to close out, Rebekah, it may be hard to distill it all down into a few key takeaways, but if there are folks watching this, listening to this, that are in that journey to growth through stores, and they want to figure out what does that journey look like for them, are there any big operational takeaways or best practices that you would call out for them to ensure that they continue to strike that balance, right? Create that great experience, but still, make sure your operations are in check. Anything key that you would share?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. And I think the thing that is can be overwhelming, and really why Recon exists, is if you've never opened or operated a store before, it can feel like you're trying to boil the ocean. There's so many little things like, oh, I forgot to like order the toilet paper. We have a
Yep.
physical bathroom. I have to order toilet paper and suddenly we're open and we don't have it, like just as a silly example. But I would say start with the MVP. Figure out, you don't need the super elaborate policies to begin with. Start with like, here's what you need to figure out: how to get inventory into your store, how to put it out on the floor, how to hire employees and train them on the basics, right? Like, you don't need to build some robust Apple training program right off the bat, right? But let's train them on product and culture. Okay, like just start with the MVP. Start at the start. And then it will build from there. You don't need to create the infrastructure of a Nike store before you open door number one, really, because you'll end up redoing a lot of it, right? Like, you're going to open your doors and 90% of what you thought is going to be wrong. That's just how it goes. Even for those of
Yeah.
us who have been doing this for 20 years, we're like, oh, I didn't expect the customers to respond that way. That's interesting. Okay, I guess we need to change. I guess we need to make an adjustment here. So I think that's it. Just don't boil the ocean. Start at the start. But then I think the other thing that is my drumbeat on this is open door one in your backyard and go there.
Mm.
Spend time in the store. I don't care if your brand is in California and Brooklyn is your number one market. Please do not open your store in Brooklyn. You will never go and you will not learn from it and you will not see the frontline team and you will not get that valuable information. Open it in your backyard, even if it's slightly lower volume. California is still a great market, right? Go to the store, just watch the customers, watch the interactions, try to sell something. That's actually one of my favorite things, is watching people who,
That's
maybe
fun.
are on a different team, talk to a customer and then have to explain the product to them. And suddenly it's like, oh, this is actually harder than I thought. So,
Yeah.
but that the learnings that will come from that will inform future product innovations. They will inform potentially even like branding changes. They will certainly inform the way that you train your employees, both in headquarters and in the stores, right? Like, oh, we're missing this whole thing and every single customer is talking about it. We need to start talking about it, right? So I think that is the most important thing. If you have a store, go to it, spend time in it, talk to the employees, watch the frontline interactions.
Amazing. Great way to close out the conversation, Rebekah. But really appreciate you taking the time out to share a little bit more about Rekon Retail, your projects, and of course, everything that you're seeing in the industry right now. Really appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me.
Thank you.
And to all of you, hope you enjoyed this conversation. I know I personally got some great takeaways. Be sure to stay tuned to more conversations coming down the pike through the summer. And of course, be sure to dig into all of the great content and conversations happening on Retail Think Tank. Like I mentioned, we'll be uploading the hub with more content, insights, data through the summer. So when you register for the hub, you'll be able to access it every day. But for now, that's it from us, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next time. Take care.